Hello again, class. Uh, Today's lesson is going to be on immigration in the 1800s, although really it's going to be focused on just the first 50 or 60 years of the 1800s, the years before the Civil War. And this will just be a one-part lesson. We'll focus on immigration, but understand that it very much ties in to everything we've been talking about lately, the urbanization of the East Coast because of the Industrial Revolution, and then Western expansion or manifest destiny, which we'll talk about in the next couple lessons after this one. So immigration ties into all of those because both of those things, the fact that America was expanding westward and gaining more and more land, and the fact that you had the Industrial Revolution leading to a couple things. One, a lot more factories needing a lot more labor, and also new and improved farming techniques that made farming easier, brought a lot of immigrants to the Americas, or to the United States specifically, in the early 19th century. All right, so let's, before we get into the details of the unit, let's talk about some key vocabulary. One, it's important that we understand these terms because when you say them, immigrant and immigrant, it's very, very difficult to hear a difference, but there's a difference in the spelling. So if you're spelling the word with an E, immigrant, that is a person who leaves a country. All right, so someone, we're going to talk about a lot about German immigration here in a minute. A German immigrant with an E is someone who left Germany. Now, if you spell it with an I and add an extra M, the word becomes immigrant, and that's a person who comes to a new country. Right? So if you're in Germany talking about a person who left for America, that person is an immigrant with an E. But if you're in America talking about someone who came over here from Germany, then it's an immigrant with an I. Okay, so you may see those two different terms in places. Just to understand their difference. All right, steerage. This is the cheapest deck or level on a ship. All right, so we talk about that because a lot of these immigrants, a lot of them are very poor, and buying a ticket on a ship was very, very expensive. So they often had to buy the cheapest, worst ticket on the ship. Often they were very poor, cramped conditions down there, oftentimes towards the bottom level of a ship. All right, famine. This is a severe shortage of food. We've talked about that when we're talking about new farming tools, the McCormick reaper, and the John Deere steel plow. We talked about how that made famine less likely in America. Well, you still had famine in other countries, which is going to be one of the factors that lead to immigration. And speaking of those factors, we talk about these as either being a push or a pull factor. These are forces that either push a person out of one country and pull them into another country. And typically for immigration, you have to have both of them to apply. For instance, if you're living in a country that has a famine, that may be a push factor, but you're unlikely to move to a country who's also having a famine. Okay? There's no pull factor there. So these two things work together, push and pull factors. And so before we get talking about the specific countries that had high number or that led to high numbers of immigrants coming to America, let's talk about these push and pull factors. First, push factors. All right, remember, push factors are factors that are causing someone to leave a country. Population growth or overcrowding. Right? Europe was a much, much more crowded place than America in the 19th century. And when you have overcrowding, you often have shortages of housing and that sort of thing. Agricultural changes. All right. Improved farming techniques. Again, an improvement sounds like it'd be good for the people working the farm, but what would happen is because you had improved farming techniques, you needed fewer people to work on the farms. and therefore the people in Europe who had, whose families may have been working on particular land for generations, were all of a sudden kicked off the land because the landowner no longer needed as many workers to work the farm. So that those people basically lost their jobs and homes because of these improved farming techniques. Crop failures. All right, so farmers who were in debt, they owed lots of money, or they were simply just too poor or hungry because of crops that were failing, there wasn't enough food going around. Both of these would be push factors. Okay, so if you're a farmer and your crop fails and you can't sell it, well, now you don't have any money. You may owe, you may have debts that you use to buy farming equipment or pay for your house or that sort of thing. And so you're basically going to be bankrupt. You're going to be kicked off your land, so you're going to need somewhere to go. Those people often come to America, or people who didn't necessarily own land in Europe to begin with, but when you had crop failures in countries, there simply wasn't enough food to go around. So they had to move to a country like America that did have enough food. Okay, so that's a push factor. The Industrial Revolution. Remember, before the Industrial Revolution, everything was made by hand, by skilled, what we call artisans. Well, the Industrial Revolution all of a sudden means things are being made by machines, and people without any particular set skills can run these machines. So these artisans, who may have spent their entire life studying and training to be a carpenter or a seamstress, someone who sews clothing, or an iron worker, or something like that. Well, now machines are doing the jobs that they used to do by hand, and so they need to move somewhere where there's more opportunities. And finally, religious and political turmoil. Right? Quakers, for instance, we talked about them a lot. They left Norway during this time period. Jews left Germany, as did non-Jewish persons, after the failed German Revolution in 1848. Okay, so if a country is discriminating against a certain religion, that pushes those religious people out of that country often. Or if a country like Germany in 1848 is going through a revolution and there's a lot of political problems, that also pushes people away from that country into a new country that has a more stable government. Now, as we're going to find out, these people immigrating in the late 1840s or early 1850s to America to get away from political turmoil, well, they're going to get in America right before the Civil War breaks out. So it may not have worked out perfectly the way they were planning, but nonetheless, political turmoil back in Europe, or as we'll see in China, those were push factors, pushing a lot of immigrants to the United States. All right, again, just because one place is pushing someone out, they still need somewhere to go. So why did they choose America? What was the pull factor in America that was bringing so many immigrants here? Freedom. America offered political freedom. They offered religious freedom. All right, so those Quakers who were having a hard time in Norway, they could come here in America and generally be left alone. The Jewish people from Germany could come to America. Now, there was discrimination against Jewish persons in America during the 19th century as well, but it may not have been quite as bad as it was in Germany. So, the fact that America promised a certain amount of political and religious freedom would pull people, certainly Europeans, to America. Now, obviously, Native Americans, African Americans aren't being given the same sort of freedom, but at least those Europeans would receive a lot of, some of these same freedoms if they came to America. So that was a pull factor. Economic opportunity. Simply put, America had lots of land, for people to start farms. They had lots and lots of factories that needed lots and lots of workers. So there was a lot of economic opportunity in America in the 19th century. Which again, I sort of jumped ahead here. You also had abundant land. America had lots and lots of land for farming. You had the Louisiana Purchase, which we've talked about a lot. You've talked about the Mexican Cession, which we'll talk about in the next lecture or two. But that was the land that America received from Mexico after the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. And, those two things more than doubled the size of America. And so all of a sudden America had lots and lots of extra land that no Americans initially were living on. And so they were, European immigrants were able to come and buy cheap land. All right, so let's talk about where these immigrants came from. And so all of these, except for one instance, which you'll see, all of these are European, again, except for one we talk about Chinese immigration. But first, let's talk about the Scandinavians. All right, those are from very northern Europe. All right, Sweden, Norway, places like that. All right, and so America's cheap public land, especially in the Midwest, lured thousands of Scandinavians, many of whom became farmers. So again, that goes back to that last point we're talking about. There was an abundant amount of land. In this land, Minnesota, Wisconsin. So that land coming in, initially up in that territory, you had the Northwest Territory, after the Treaty of Paris. But then again, even further west of that, after you had Louisiana Purchase, all this land is added to America. Lots and lots of good farmland. Many people in that area are still farmers today. And this lured thousands of Scandinavians. All right, German immigration. All right, so we already talked about how there was a failed German Revolution in the 1840s that pushed people out. We talked about discrimination against Jewish people, pushed them out of Germany in the mid-19th century. What pulled them to America? One, many Germans moved to the Midwest because the climate allowed them to continue their traditional farming methods. As you should know, maybe you talked about this a little bit in Texas history class last year, many Germans moved to Texas and founded towns such as New Braunfels, Fredericksburg. So a lot of towns in central Texas today have a German origin, were founded by German immigrants 150, 175 years ago. The German immigrants did not move just to cities. Did not move just to farms. They also moved to cities as well. And again, so for instance, we talked about how one of the push factors for German Jewish immigrants. We talked about the push factors from Germany. But the pull factor were many of these Jewish immigrants worked as traveling salespeople. They opened stores. They did that sort of thing. All right, so those would often have been living in the cities. So we talked about how Germans didn't just move to farms; they also moved to cities. Here are some of the examples of jobs they did in cities. And while we don't think about German being a big immigration population, they were in fact the largest immigrant group in America in the 1800s. People, I think, don't often think about it being as a big immigrant or ethnic group in America, just because Germans have been here for so long. A lot of their general and traditional ethnic practices have been sort of absorbed into and become part of American culture. For instance, German immigrants contributed to America, including the Christmas tree, kindergarten, hamburgers, frankfurters, which would eventually be turned into hot dogs. All of these were either brought from Germany or created by German immigrants. Okay, and so that's why I don't think people think of Germans as a big immigration group or ethnic group in America. It's because so many of their original contributions, going back 200 years now, have been so ingrained in American culture, like hamburgers and hot dogs, Christmas trees, that we just think of them as American, although they really do have their origins among German immigrants. All right, the Irish immigration. All right, so there were two significant push factors that caused Irish immigration to America. One, many Irish Catholics did not like being ruled and discriminated against by British Protestants. Okay, remember, Protestants, they're Christians, but they don't answer to the Pope. They're not part of the Catholic wing of Christianity. And so, by then Britain had become an overwhelmingly Protestant country, as was America, by the way. America was very, very much Protestant. But Irish were among the first big Catholic immigrants. Now, I know we've talked about how back in the 1600s, Maryland was founded by English Catholics, and that was true. But then Irish becomes the first big immigrant group after independence to come to America and bring large numbers of Catholics to America. All right, now, quite frankly, Catholics were still discriminated against in America too. All right, America would not have its first Catholic president until John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. And here recently we just elected our second Catholic president, Joe Biden. All right, so throughout the 19th century, you did have discrimination against Catholics here in America, but it wasn't as quite as harsh as it was back in Britain. So that was one of the reasons Catholics would move to America, or that was one of the push factors, excuse me. The second big push factor of why they wanted to leave Ireland was what's called the Irish potato famine. All right, so due to some British policies, by the way, let's just explain this. Britain had conquered Ireland sometime in the 1700s. It's really not important for our class. But Britain ruled Ireland back in the 19th century. And they didn't always, or they weren't always real nice about it. And due to some policies like mercantilism, Britain basically forced Irish to spend most of their farming activity growing potatoes. Well, there was some disease that killed the potato crop in the mid-1840s. And so since that had become Ireland's main primary food source, when the potato crop died, that led to massive starvation, led to a famine that killed 1 million people in Ireland. And it wasn't a very, very big island. 1 million people was a huge percentage of its population. And so within the next 10 years, between 1.5 and 2 million Irish immigrants left the island. And again, I forget the exact percentage of that, but I believe I want to say that's something like 20 or 25% of the Irish population left because of the potato famine. So those are both push factors. What were the pull factors that drew the Irish to America? Because after all, they could have moved, theoretically anywhere in the world. Why come to America? Well, they found a lot of opportunities in American cities. And by the 1850s, the Irish made up about 1/4 of the population in big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. And they become so important. That's why St. Patrick's is a relatively big holiday in America. It's from these large numbers of Irish immigrants in the mid-19th century that make up a pretty significant portion of the population. Now, many of the Irish immigrants who were coming were uneducated and unskilled laborers. Right? They'd probably been working on potato farms or things like that, and so they didn't necessarily have specialized skills, and so they were often forced to take very, very low-paying jobs. And in the North, they'd often compete with free African American for the lowest-paying jobs. And I tell you that now because I want you to remember that, because that's going to lead to a very significant event during the Civil War, were called the Draft Riots that take place in New York City in 1863. And so understand that the Irish viewed these new Irish immigrants viewed free African Americans as competing for their jobs in the North, and that's going to cause a lot of tension between the two groups. All right, so we talked a lot about European immigration. Let's switch over to Asia and talk about Chinese immigration. All right, so in the mid-1800s, you had political rebellion in China that led to the death of 20 million Chinese peasants. Okay? A peasant is just a very poor person who's typically tied into working the land. All right, so 20 million of them died during the political rebellion in the mid-19th century. Then around that same time period, 1852 to be exact, the Yellow River in China flooded and destroyed crops that also led to famine. All right, so again, now you have 20 million people dying in revolution. Now you have a famine that's going to kill people. And yet, what was happening in America? Well, lo and behold, California, which again, geography is very important here. California is on the far west coast. Okay? Most of those European immigrants, Irish, Scandinavians, Germans, they're going to be traveling here. Everybody had to travel by boat back then. Remember, if you want to cross an ocean, you had to get there by boat. So boats typically go to from one side of the ocean to the other, the nearest land. And so those European immigrants are going to land in New York City in the East Coast. These Chinese immigrants, since they're coming from Asia, they're coming from a different part of the world, they're going to be traveling across the Pacific Ocean. So they're all going to land on the West Coast, place like California. Well, lo and behold, gold was discovered in California, drawing lots and lots of people to the state. All right, so when you add in the fact that gold had just been discovered in California, and then you had all these problems in China around the 1840s and 1850s. That's going to lead to a lot of Chinese immigration. Next, in the mid-1800s, American railroad companies hired thousands of Chinese immigrants to help build the railroads, which is why the picture I have taken. Now, granted, this picture was not taken in the mid-1800s. It probably been later in the century, but starting in the mid-19th century, railroad companies hired many Chinese immigrants to help them build the railroads. So I put on here think, don't write, but you may actually want to write down next to each of these bullet points whether these was a push or pull factor. Okay. So the fact that political rebellion in China led to 20 million deaths, well, that's a push factor. That's pushing Chinese persons, especially Chinese peasants, out of China to avoid the rebellion. The famine caused by the Yellow River flood. That's also going to be a push factor. It's going to push people out of their country to go look for a place with more stable food supply. The gold rush in California, well, that's a pull factor. That's going to pull people from all over the world, including China, are like, hey, there's gold in California. Let's move there. And finally, jobs building railroads. That also is a pull factor. That's going to pull people to America. To understand how these push and pull factors work. All right, so what was the effect of immigration in America? One, both immigrants and Americans were moving to cities in large numbers in the 1800s. For instance, you had a 30-year period in New York City. The population went from 60,000 to about 200,000. Okay, so it more than tripled. And then cities all over the country saw their population doubling basically every 7 to 9 years. So this is a time where cities were becoming much more heavily populated. And remember, we looked at these maps or charts during the Industrial Revolution, and we saw that there was a lot more people living in urban areas versus rural areas. Well, these are the numbers to back that up. All right, but when all of a sudden you have these, relatively small cities of 50, 60, 70,000, and all of a sudden now you have hundreds of thousands of people living there, think for a second about what problem that's going to cause. And it was the same problems that had already taken place in Europe when those cities became overcrowded. It leads to housing shortage. Because, when you have housing for 60,000 people, and then all of a sudden within 7 years you have twice as many people living in a place, well, you may not have built twice as many houses during those 7 years. That's a lot of work to build that many houses so quickly. So you're often going to have a housing shortage. And my question there, what led to urbanization? I've already given it away. It was the Industrial Revolution, putting factories in towns that then required lots and lots of workers. So because of this housing shortage, people are forced to live in what were called tenements. These are very small, cramped, and dirty apartments. All right, you might have multiple families who may or may not have even known each other, living in basically one general apartment. And so everybody was crammed in there, and this would be the case in, you'd have an entire apartment building that had multiple families living in each of these, the actual apartment units themselves. All right, so there was lots and lots of overcrowding, and sometimes this could lead, to disaster, because you had so many people in the building. And buildings back then were still made out of a lot of wood versus concrete or iron or steel, And so if you might have a fire break out in a building, and you may have dozens and dozens of people up on the 5th or 6th floor of these buildings, and there's no way for them to get down in case of a fire. So you had tragedies dealing with these tenements. But even if you didn't have a drastic tragedy like a fire that killed lots of people, you still had just horrible day-to-day living conditions. All right. And then when you put this many people without housing into such a small, relatively small space, you tend to have an increase in crime. And to try to help some of these conditions, immigrant groups created what are called aid societies. Right? These were aimed at helping new immigrants. Right? If you've ever seen a movie about the 1800s and it's telling the story about immigrants coming to America, when the immigrant, there's always a scene they see the Statue of Liberty, which quite frankly wasn't even put up in the early 1800s, but nonetheless they'll see it. They'll travel in, they'll get off their boat, and one of the first things they do is end up in an aid society office where they're talking to someone, often from their same European country, who says, okay, well, if you go talk to this person, they might help you find a job. You go talk to this other person, they may help you find housing. All right, these were aid societies, so a lot of these had to be created to help all these new immigrants, because people in Europe thought, oh, well, if you go to America, it has all this land, it has all these jobs, all your problems will be over. And that wasn't always true. It's true America had lots and lots of land and lots of jobs, but always necessarily getting the immigrants to the right place where you had this land or this job and being given the job and not being discriminated against, et cetera, et cetera. The promise that these immigrants had back in Europe wasn't always coming to wasn't always matching what they expected of. I'll put it that way. And so you had these aid societies to try to help these immigrants. And then politicians also set up organizations to help. But let's be honest, a lot of these politicians were doing it expecting to receive votes from the grateful immigrants. So it was a situation like, hey, I'm a politician, and hey, I know I'll help you get housing. And by the way, there's an election in 3 months, and if I'm going to help you get housing, I'd really like you to, vote and help me get elected. All right, so it was sort of that type of situation. But nonetheless, politicians did set up organizations that helped immigrants. But I've already mentioned it before, but one reason, or actually, I guess I've mentioned it multiple times during this lecture, there was a lot of prejudice against immigrants during this time period. And so many native-born Americans began to oppose immigration. And so the immigrants faced anger and prejudice due to their race, ethnicity, religion. For instance, we talked about America was a Protestant country, but now with the Irish, you had a lot more Catholics moving in. You had Jewish people moving in from Germany. You had the Chinese moving in from China, who not only did they have a different religion, had an entirely different race and ethnicity as well. All right, so there was lots and lots of prejudice. And so some Americans called themselves nativists. All right, a nativist is a native-born person who wants to eliminate influence from immigrants. All right, so I guess they didn't like Christmas trees and hamburgers. And these nativists were claiming that, oh well, these immigrants are going to change the country, change our culture, and we don't want that, and they shouldn't be allowed to influence our culture. And so these nativists would form secret societies in places like New York City and Boston, and they would do things like promising not to vote for immigrants or not to vote for Catholics. Like I said, it wouldn't be until 1960 that America elected its first Catholic president. All right, it wouldn't be until 2020 that it elected its second Catholic president. All right, so this anti-Catholic bias, this anti-immigrant bias, would obviously continue much beyond the 1800s. And sometimes when the persons would be asked about these secret societies, they would answer, "I know nothing about it. I know nothing about it." And so eventually, a lot of these nativists formed a political party, and since they would constantly, claim that they knew nothing about the party or about discriminatory practices, they became known as the Know Nothing Party. So it sounds like an odd name for political party, but it goes back to, they were trying to keep their secret pledges not to vote for immigrants or Catholics secret, so they would claim to know nothing. So they ultimately were called the Know Nothing Party. All right, so that is the end of our lesson on immigration. Our next lecture will talk about manifest destiny and Western expansion.